To the family who mistook my silence for ignorance, Mr. Bell read, and the sound of those 11 words seemed to pull the warmth out of the room. The breakfast table at the Whitmore estate had never been loud, but this silence was different. It was sharp. It had edges. Silverware sat untouched on white china. A crystal glass sweated beside a folded linen napkin. Somewhere beyond the tall kitchen windows, a sprinkler ticked across the lawn in slow, measured bursts, but inside, no one moved. Evelyn Whitmore, still in her cream cashmere robe, lifted her eyes from her coffee with the kind of disbelief reserved for public embarrassment and private fear. Her husband, Grant, had one hand resting on the morning paper, though he hadn't turned a page in nearly a minute. And Claire, their daughter, usually too detached to care about anything happening before noon, lowered her phone without realizing she'd done it. Mr. Bell stood near the marble island with the envelope open in his gloved hands, his posture perfect, his voice steady, though even he seemed unsettled by the weight of the words. Naomi Carter's name was written across the front in neat blue ink. Not rushed, not angry, careful, intentional, as if she had known exactly where this letter would land, exactly who would hear it, and exactly what it would do. Evelyn gave a short, humorless laugh, but it didn't last. That can't be how she wrote it, she said, too quickly, the confidence in her voice clipped and brittle. She probably had someone help her. Mr. Bell did not answer. He only glanced down and continued reading with the same formal restraint he used for legal notices and funeral arrangements. I heard every word you thought was hidden by your polished voices, your lowered tones, and your assumptions. The sentence settled over the kitchen like cold dust. Grant slowly removed his glasses. Claire looked from her mother to the letter, something unreadable passing across her face. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the handle of her coffee cup, though she did not drink. For a moment, no one spoke, and the estate itself seemed to lean in. The refrigerator hummed softly. A clock somewhere down the hall marked another second. On the far counter, Naomi's absence was strangely visible, as if order itself had been disturbed by her leaving. The fruit had not been sliced, the way it always was. The tea tray was missing its spoons. A stack of mail sat unopened because no one had thought to sort it. She had only been gone since dawn, and already the house felt less precise, less held together, less intelligent, somehow. Mr. Bell swallowed once, almost imperceptibly, and read on. You spoke as though I were furniture with hands. Something to move quietly around your lives while you said what you pleased. Claire's breath caught first, not loudly, just enough to be heard in the stillness. Evelyn turned toward her daughter, then back to the letter, her expression hardening as if that alone could restore control. But control was already slipping, not with shouting, not with scandal, but with language. Clean, elegant, unmistakable language. And as Mr. Bell lifted the page to continue, the morning light moved across the marble floor inch by inch, touching the empty space where Naomi always stood. Claire was the first to look away, not because she did not want to hear more, but because hearing it felt too much like being seen. Her eyes dropped to the polished walnut table where a faint ring from someone else's coffee cup had not been wiped clean, a small flaw in a house Naomi usually kept immaculate. Grant leaned back in his chair, slow and stiff, as if the air itself had changed weight. He had spent 20 years inside boardrooms where men lost millions without blinking. Yet the careful shape of Naomi Carter's words unsettled him more than any market drop ever had. Evelyn remained still, almost impressively so, but stillness on her looked less like grace now and more like resistance. Her posture stayed perfect. Her chin stayed lifted. Only the small pulse at the base of her throat betrayed her. Mr. Bell lowered the page for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what the room had become. He had served the Whitmores long enough to recognize a turning point when one arrived. This was not a household disagreement. This was a mirror being held up in morning light. Keep reading, Grant said quietly. His voice had lost its usual edge. Mr. Bell gave a slight nod and obeyed. I learned very early that some people speak most freely when they think the person beside them is beneath them. That has always been your favorite kind of comfort. Evelyn set down her cup with more force than intended. The porcelain tapped sharply against the saucer, then settled into silence again. This is absurd, she said, but the words sounded thin in that large kitchen, thinner than steam, thinner than pride. Claire finally raised her head. It does not sound absurd, she said, her voice low, almost careful. It sounds like Naomi. That landed harder than anything else so far. Evelyn turned toward her daughter with a look she might once have used to end a conversation before it began, but Claire did not retreat. She had Naomi's habit of holding still when something mattered. Grant noticed it too. For one strange second, the similarity pressed itself into the room like another accusation. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past the front gate, its tires humming over the gravel drive. The ordinary sound made the kitchen feel even stranger, as if the rest of the world had continued without permission. Mr. Bell went on. I do not mention these things to wound you. I mention them because truth should not need wealth, whiteness, or invitation before it is allowed to stand in a room. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Grant looked down at the table. Evelyn did not move at all. The refrigerator compressor clicked off, and in the sudden quiet that followed, every detail became painfully audible. The faint rustle of the letter in Mr. Bell's hands, the ticking of the French clock in the hall, the whisper of central air through the ceiling vents. Naomi had lived inside those sounds for nearly 2 years. She had heard every lowered voice, every unfinished sentence, every polished cruelty that had floated across marble and linen and candlelight. And she had answered none of it. Not then. That was what made the letter feel so devastating now. It was not written in anger. It was written in patience, in memory, in control. Claire looked toward the back hallway, to the narrow service door Naomi always used even though the front foyer was closer. She pictured her there before dawn, coat buttoned, shoulders square, leaving without waking the house that had measured her so poorly. When did she write this? Claire asked. Mr. Bell glanced at the final page. Late last night, I would imagine. His eyes moved once more across the neat blue handwriting. And if I may say so, Miss Claire, she wrote it after thinking for a very long time. The night before, the Whitmore house had glowed the way expensive houses always did when they wanted to look effortless. Candlelight moved across glass walls. The brass fixtures in the dining room reflected soft amber light, like they had been polished for royalty. Outside, the pool lay still beneath a line of garden lanterns, and inside, everything smelled faintly of lemon oil, fresh linen, and the rosemary butter warming under silver covers in the kitchen. Naomi Carter moved through it all with a tray balanced in both hands, silent and steady in her black uniform, her steps measured on the wide oak floors. She knew the rhythm of that house better than anyone in it. She knew which stair tread side near the landing, which cabinet door needed an extra push, which guest liked sparkling water without ice, which vase Evelyn thought looked casual but cost more than Naomi's first car. By 7:30, the first guests had arrived. By 8, the dining room was full of low laughter, thin crystal, and the kind of conversation that always sounded polite from a distance and sharper up close. Naomi entered through the side door carrying a fresh bottle of Pinot Noir, and that was when she heard Evelyn's voice drift across the table, light and careless. You do not have to lower your voice, she told the woman beside her. She does not understand enough English to follow this kind of conversation. A few people smiled into their glasses. Someone gave a soft laugh. Naomi did not stop walking. She moved to Grant's side first, poured, then to the guest on his left, her wrist perfectly still, the deep red ribbon of wine never touching the rim. Honestly, Evelyn added, adjusting the cuff of her ivory sleeve. That is part of what makes her so restful. No opinions. No little comments. Just work. The woman beside her murmured something Naomi could not fully catch, but she heard 2 words clearly. Sweet and simple. Another laugh followed, quieter this time, cushioned by linen and candlelight. Naomi set the bottle down on the sideboard with care, then lifted a serving spoon from the roast vegetables as if nothing at all had happened. Her face remained composed, but inside, something old and familiar pressed against her ribs. Not surprise. Not even anger. Recognition. She had heard versions of that tone her whole life, in stores, in waiting rooms, in offices where people smiled too quickly and explained things too slowly. What stung was not the insult. It was the comfort with which it was offered, as if her presence had already been reduced to background. Claire sat halfway down the table, one elbow near her untouched salad plate, watching more than speaking as usual. When Naomi stepped beside her to replace a fork, Claire looked up for half a second, and in that half second Naomi wondered if the girl had heard it too. But Claire only lowered her eyes again, fingers turning her water glass in a slow circle. At the head of the table, Grant kept eating. Mr. Bell moved in and out from the pantry with his usual quiet precision. The dinner continued. Evelyn moved on to talk of a museum board, a charity luncheon, a designer who had disappointed her in Palm Beach. Her voice floated easily over the clink of silverware. Naomi kept serving. Mashed potatoes, green beans, warm rolls wrapped in a folded white cloth. She did not hurry. She did not fumble. She did not let her hands betray what her ears had taken in. Yet each word stayed with her, settling one by one like stones in clear water. By the time she returned to the kitchen for the dessert plates, the house still looked beautiful, still sounded refined, and Naomi knew with complete certainty that before the night was over, something inside her would change. Dessert came out on white porcelain plates edged in gold, each slice of pear tart arranged with a precision Naomi had learned from months of correcting other people's carelessness before it became Evelyn's disappointment. The vanilla bean cream sat in a silver bowl nested in crushed ice, and the coffee service waited on a rolling cart near the archway, polished until the metal reflected the chandelier in warped, trembling stars. Naomi carried the first 2 plates to the table just as one of Evelyn's guests, a woman with a bright silk scarf and a voice too eager for cruelty, glanced toward her and smiled in that practiced way wealthy women sometimes did when they wanted to make contempt look playful. "Where did you find her?" the woman asked, not lowering her voice at all. "She is so composed." Evelyn dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin and gave a soft laugh. "An agency in Hartford," she said, though I had to be patient at first. Her English was very rough. Naomi placed a plate in front of Claire, then another beside Grant, her hands steady, her face unreadable. "Very rough?" Evelyn repeated, leaning back slightly as if telling a harmless story. Now she understands the basics. Table settings, schedules, laundry instructions, that sort of thing. The silk scarf woman tilted her head. "That must make things easier." "It does," Evelyn said. "You can say nearly anything around someone who only catches every 4th word." This time the laughter was broader. Grant exhaled through his nose, not quite laughing, not quite objecting. Mr. Bell, standing near the pantry door with the coffee pot, lowered his eyes in a way Naomi had come to recognize as controlled disapproval. Claire stopped moving her fork. Naomi felt the room sharpen around her. The candle flames along the center of the table flickered in the draft from the vent above, and for one strange second, every sound separated itself with painful clarity. Ice clinking in a glass, fabric brushing a chair leg, the faint tap of Claire's thumbnail against her water goblet. Naomi moved to Evelyn's side to place the final dessert plate. "Thank you," Evelyn said to her without looking up, then turned back to the table and added, "She really is very good with repetition. Show her once, maybe twice, and eventually it settles in." The woman across from her smiled. "Well, that is one kind of intelligence." Someone at the far end of the table murmured, "And very loyal, I imagine." Evelyn gave a small shrug. "Dependable, yes. They usually are when they know they are lucky." There it was. Not even hidden now. Not coated in cleverness. Just laid out between crystal stemware and folded linen like another course in the meal. Naomi felt heat rise beneath her skin, but she did not let it reach her face. Instead, she turned toward the coffee cart and lifted the silver pot, the handle warm through the folded service cloth. She poured for the guest nearest the window, then the man beside her, then Claire, who looked up as if she wanted to say something and could not find a shape for it. Naomi met her eyes only. Briefly. In that brief glance, Claire looked young for the first time that evening. Not careless, not aloof, only uncertain. Evelyn kept speaking. "I do not mean that unkindly," she said, which made it worse. "Some people are simply better suited to service. Less confusion that way. Less ambition." Naomi set the coffee pot down with care, so exact it made no sound at all. Then she reached for the sugar bowl, her fingers calm, her shoulders level, and understood with sudden, almost painful clarity that silence was no longer protecting her peace. It was only protecting theirs. What happened next was small enough that most people at the table never understood how close it came to becoming a disaster. Evelyn had just lifted her coffee cup when the man seated 2 chairs down from Grant loosened his tie and frowned at the dessert plate in front of him. "I am sorry," he said, setting down his fork. Did this have almond paste in the glaze? The question landed gently, but it changed the air. Evelyn blinked. I do not believe so, she said, though the uncertainty in her voice gave her away at once. The man gave a strained smile. I asked your assistant on the phone this morning to note my allergy. Tree nuts. Grant turned his head. The silk scarf woman looked down at her plate, as if hoping not to be involved. Mr. Bell stood still near the pantry, already calculating. Naomi did not wait. She stepped forward, lifted the dessert plate before the guest could touch it again, and said in a calm, even voice, It has almond extract in the glaze, sir, but no almond flour. Still, I would not recommend it. The table went quiet for a different reason this time. The guest looked up at her with visible relief. Thank you, he said. I appreciate that. Naomi inclined her head once. I can bring fresh berries and cream from the kitchen in under 2 minutes. She did not look at Evelyn when she said it. She did not need to. The silence at the table had already begun to tilt. Yes, Grant said quickly, recovering first. Please do that. Naomi turned at once, black flats soundless against the hardwood as she moved through the archway and into the kitchen. Inside, the warmth hit harder. Copper pans hung over the center island. The air smelled of pastry, dish soap, and the low clean scent of the sanitizer Mr. Bell preferred on formal nights. Naomi set the plate down on the prep counter and exhaled once through her nose. Not dramatically, not shakily, just enough to clear the pressure from her chest. Then she moved. She pulled a chilled bowl of blackberries and raspberries from the lower refrigerator drawer, spooned whipped cream into a small crystal dish, added a mint sprig, and wiped the rim with the corner of a linen cloth. Her motions were swift and exact, the kind built from repetition and pride, not panic. She had caught the almond note that afternoon when the catering sheet arrived from the bakery. She had written a correction in the margin herself, in neat block letters, and placed the sheet on the kitchen clipboard where Evelyn never bothered to read beyond the header. She returned to the dining room in less than 90 seconds. The guest smiled with genuine gratitude this time. You just saved me a very long night, he said. Naomi set the replacement dessert before him. I am glad I could help. Claire was watching her now, openly. Not with pity. Not with the lazy curiosity of someone noticing staff for the first time. With attention. Real attention. Naomi moved to collect the untouched tart, and as she did, Claire's gaze dropped to the small cream-colored card tucked near the coffee service. It was the place card arrangement for the charity luncheon Evelyn planned to host the following afternoon. Naomi had adjusted it earlier with a blue pencil when she saw that 2 donors from rival foundations had been seated side by side. Claire had noticed the change then too. She had said nothing, but she had seen the handwriting, seen the elegant spelling, seen the note in the margin that read, better to separate them before smiles become headlines. Naomi took the ruined dessert back toward the kitchen, and behind her, she heard Evelyn laugh too brightly at something no one had really said. That was when Claire understood what the rest of them still refused to see. Naomi was not simply managing trays and tablecloths and polished silver. She had been quietly managing them. By the time the last coffee cup had been cleared and the final guest drifted toward the front hall in a cloud of perfume, handshakes, and polished goodbyes, the house had settled into that strange hour when luxury looked tired. The candles had burned lower. Melted wax clung to the brass holders in pale, uneven collars. One of the dining chairs sat slightly crooked from where someone had pushed back too quickly, and the lemon slices floating in the water pitchers had begun to curl at the edges. Naomi carried the last dessert plates into the kitchen and stacked them beside the sink with quiet precision, porcelain touching porcelain in soft, controlled clicks. Mr. Bell was overseeing the cleanup near the industrial dishwasher, his sleeves still perfect, his silver hair undisturbed, but even he looked older under the colder lights of the back kitchen. You handled that well, he said without turning. Naomi reached for a folded towel and began wiping the prep counter. It needed handling, she replied. Her voice was even, neither proud nor wounded. Just true. Mr. Bell gave the faintest nod, as if he had expected no other answer. A minute later he stepped into the pantry to check the wine inventory, and the kitchen fell into a different kind of silence, the working silence Naomi preferred. Water ran in a thin, clear stream. The dishwasher hissed and clicked. Somewhere down the back hallway, the old dryer thumped once, then stopped. Naomi dried her hands, crossed to the small side table where the luncheon materials had been left, and straightened the stack of place cards Evelyn had carelessly scattered before guests arrived. She paused over the seating chart, picked up a blue pencil, and moved one card 2 spots down. Then another. Then she wrote a brief note in the margin in the same neat hand that had shaped every pantry label and dry cleaning list in the house for nearly 2 years. Do not seat Mrs. Galloway beside and Pierce. Last year's auction dispute is still unresolved. She had just set the pencil down when she sensed someone behind her. Claire stood in the doorway, one hand resting lightly against the frame, still wearing the pale green dress from dinner, though she had slipped off her heels. Without them, she looked younger, almost uncertain, like someone who had walked into a room by instinct and then forgotten what excuse to use. Naomi did not startle. She simply looked up. "Did you need something, Miss Claire?" Claire's eyes dropped to the seating chart, then to the note in the margin. "That was your handwriting on the card earlier," she said. It was not a question. Naomi folded the towel once, then again. "Yes." Claire stepped closer, her gaze catching on the row of labeled file folders near the corkboard, on the grocery lists written in a careful hand, on the French phrase Naomi had corrected on the printed luncheon menu that afternoon, with one small mark of blue pencil. "You understand all of it," Claire said softly. Naomi held her eyes for a moment. Not defensively, not dramatically, just plainly. "I understand enough." Claire let out a breath that sounded almost like shame. The refrigerator motor kicked on beneath the counter, filling the pause with a low mechanical hum. "My mother thinks you do not," Claire said. Naomi looked back down at the seating chart and aligned its corners with the edge of the table. "Your mother thinks many things when it is convenient." The words were not sharp, but they landed with a quiet force that made Claire straighten. For the first time that night, Naomi saw something honest break through the polish in the younger woman's face. Not guilt alone. Recognition. Claire moved her hand from the doorframe and glanced around the kitchen as if seeing it properly for the first time. The lists, the timings, the coded notes, the order that did not appear by magic and never had. "You keep this house running," she said. Naomi reached for the place cards and stacked them neatly. "No," she answered, her voice calm as winter glass. "I keep it from falling apart where no one can see." The moment did not last. Footsteps crossed the hall outside, quick and sharp against the hardwood, and then Evelyn appeared in the kitchen doorway with the restless brightness of someone who had smiled too long in front of guests and now needed somewhere to place her irritation. She had changed nothing except the way she held herself. The pearls were still at her throat. The silk still caught the light at her wrists. But the charm she wore in the dining room was gone. Her eyes went first to Claire, then to Naomi, then to the luncheon materials spread neatly across the side table. "Why is that chart out?" she asked. Naomi turned slightly, the folded towel still in her hands. "I was organizing tomorrow's seating, ma'am." Evelyn stepped closer and saw the blue pencil note in the margin. Her expression hardened at once. "You were doing what?" Claire straightened from the doorway. "Mother." She was only fixing the. Evelyn lifted one hand, not dramatically, just enough to cut the sentence in half. "I was not speaking to you." Then her gaze returned to Naomi. "Who told you to write on my planning sheets?" The kitchen seemed to cool by a degree. Mr. Bell emerged from the pantry at the edge of the room and stopped when he sensed the shift, a wine ledger still in one hand. Naomi set the towel down beside the sink. "No one told me to, ma'am. I noticed a conflict and made a note so you would not be blindsided tomorrow." Evelyn let out a short laugh that held no amusement at all. "A conflict?" She picked up the chart between 2 fingers as if it had been mishandled. "You noticed a conflict." Claire's face tightened. "She is right about Mrs. Galloway and in Pierce. They have not spoken since the Aspen auction." Evelyn ignored her daughter completely. "This is exactly the problem," she said, her voice low and precise now, the kind of softness that cut more cleanly than shouting ever could. A little familiarity, a few repeated tasks, and suddenly boundaries disappear. You are staff, Naomi. You set tables. You do not involve yourself in guest dynamics, donor strategy, or anything that requires discretion. Naomi stood very still. The dishwasher hissed behind her. Somewhere overhead, a vent clicked on and sent a cool stream of air across the back of her neck. "I understand discretion, ma'am," she said. Evelyn looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in that calm answer seemed to offend her more than any apology would have. "Do you?" she asked. "Because from where I am standing, It seems instructions may be more difficult for you than I realized. Claire inhaled sharply. Mr. Bell lowered his eyes. Naomi felt the words move through her like cold water, not because they were new, but because they had finally been spoken without disguise. For a moment no one moved. The refrigerator hummed. The scent of coffee still lingered over the sanitizer and warm dishwater. On the prep counter, the silver cake server caught the ceiling light and flashed once like a signal. Naomi folded her hands loosely in front of her apron and met Evelyn's gaze with a steadiness that made Claire's breath catch again. I understand enough, ma'am, she said. Nothing in her voice rose. Nothing trembled. Yet the sentence landed in the kitchen with the force of something final. Evelyn's chin lifted. Then perhaps you understand that I expect the breakfast tray set by 7. The flowers changed before 9, and no further notes added to anything unless I asked for them personally. Naomi held her eyes for 1 second longer, then inclined her head once. Yes, ma'am. But inside, the answer had already changed. By the time Evelyn turned and left the kitchen in a trail of perfume and offended dignity, Naomi knew with absolute clarity that she would not be there at 7. After the kitchen emptied, Naomi finished the last of her duties with the same care she had given the house on every other night, which somehow made each movement feel heavier. She dried the serving spoons and returned them to the felt-lined drawer beside the range. She folded the white dinner napkins into neat squares and stacked them in the pantry cabinet by size, not because anyone would notice, but because leaving disorder behind would have felt like letting their opinion of her touch something real. The house had gone quiet above her. A floorboard murmured once in the hall outside the family bedrooms. Plumbing sighed in the walls. Somewhere in the distance, a grandfather clock marked 10, then a quarter past, then half past, each chime thinning into the soft mechanical breath of central air. Naomi moved through the back hallway with a basket of fresh dish towels on one hip, changing out the damp ones near the sink, wiping a faint streak of coffee from the marble island, straightening the breakfast tray Evelyn had ordered for 7, even though Naomi already knew she would not be there to place it on the sunroom table. 2 bone china cups, silver sugar tongs, sliced grapefruit in a chilled bowl, a folded cream napkin. She set each piece exactly where it belonged, then stood for a moment with both hands resting lightly on the counter, looking at the tray as if it belonged to someone else's life. When she finally turned toward the staff room at the end of the corridor, the light under the door made a small gold rectangle across the floor. Inside, the room was modest and clean, with one narrow locker, a wooden chair, and a shelf where she kept her extra shoes, her lunch tote, and a paperback with a bent spine. Naomi hung her apron on its hook and reached into the top drawer for the stationery she kept there for grocery notes and dry cleaning lists. The paper was plain, thick, and cream-colored. She sat down at the small desk beneath the lamp and uncapped her blue pen. For several seconds she did not write. She only listened. The faint hum of the estate at rest. The refrigerator far down the hall. Wind touching the hedges outside the back entrance. She thought of Evelyn's voice at dinner, smooth as satin and just as cold. She thought of the laughter that followed. She thought of Claire in the doorway, eyes lowered over the seating chart, seeing at last what had always been in front of her. Then Naomi lowered the pen to paper and began. Her handwriting came out steady, elegant, almost formal, the words aligned in clean rows that did not slant even once. She did not write to wound. That became clear even to herself by the third sentence. She wrote because silence had reached its limit. She wrote because leaving without truth would have felt like one more act of service. Line by line, she set down what she had heard, what she had understood, and what she had chosen to endure until dignity required a different answer. When she finished, the letter was 3 pages long. She read it once under the yellow desk lamp, made one small correction in the margin, then signed her name at the bottom with a hand that did not shake. Naomi folded the pages carefully and slid them into an envelope. On the front she wrote, "For the Whitmore family," in the same neat blue ink. After that, her leaving was simple. She changed into her dark wool coat, placed her keys on the desk in the kitchen beside the breakfast tray, and set the envelope where it could not be missed. Then she took one last look at the room she had kept orderly for nearly 2 years. The counters gleamed. The flowers by the sink had fresh water. The morning would arrive exactly as expected, at least for a few minutes. Naomi turned off the light and stepped out through the service door into the cold Connecticut dark, where the air smelled like wet cedar and the first edge of winter. Morning arrived on schedule, but the house did not. At 6:45, the sun slipped through the east windows in long pale bands, touching the marble counters and the copper fruit bowl and the untouched breakfast tray Naomi had arranged only hours earlier. For a few brief minutes, everything looked exactly as it should have. Then the gaps began to show. The grapefruit had not been sprinkled with sugar because Naomi usually did that last, just before serving. The flowers in the front hall were still in yesterday's water because she had planned to change them after sunrise. The driver called from the garage asking whether Mrs. Whitmore still needed the town car at 9:30 or 10, and no one in the kitchen knew because Naomi was the one who kept the final handwritten schedule tucked beneath the silver message clipped by the phone. By 7:10, Evelyn was already annoyed. By 7:20, she was unsettled. She stepped into the kitchen in a pressed ivory blouse, saw the tray still waiting on the counter, and stopped. "Where is she?" she asked into the room, though no one there could answer. One of the temporary cleaning girls had been sent from the agency for the morning, but she stood frozen by the pantry shelves, overwhelmed by the labeled bins, the coded lunch notes, the list clipped to corkboard with no explanation of what had to happen first. Mr. Bell arrived from the front hall with a look Naomi had never once seen on him before, disarray. Not visible disarray. Not wrinkled clothes or raised voice. Something rarer. A disturbance in precision. "The florist is at the service in trance," he said. "They need confirmation on table placement for the luncheon. Also, the Galloway office called. They moved Mrs. Galloway's arrival up by 40 minutes. Claire came in barefoot, her hair still loose over one shoulder, and took in the scene with one long glance. The fruit knives had been set out, but not aligned. The coffee had been brewed, but not poured into the warmer. A folder sat on the island labeled Luncheon Final, and beside it lay the envelope in Naomi's neat blue handwriting. Claire saw it before anyone else. She did not touch it yet. Evelyn was too busy discovering smaller disasters. "Why are the place cards not finished?" she asked. "Why is the dietary list not attached to the catering order? And why isn't Pierce still next to Mrs. Galloway?" Her voice sharpened with each question, not because the mistakes were huge, but because they were multiplying in all the places she had never noticed Naomi standing between. Grant entered a moment later, tie half done, reading glasses in one hand. "What is going on?" he asked. "Everything is an inch off," Evelyn snapped. Grant looked around and understood more quickly than she did. The house was not failing loudly. It was failing precisely where only competence usually prevented failure from appearing. Claire stepped to the island and picked up the envelope. "She left this," she said. The room quieted, though not completely. The driver was still speaking faintly through the wall intercom. Water hissed into the espresso machine. Somewhere down the corridor, a vacuum started, then stopped. Evelyn held out her hand. "Give it here." Claire did not move. "No," she said softly. "You should hear it." Grant studied the envelope for 1 second, then turned to Mr. Bell. "Read it." Evelyn let out a brittle breath. "Oh, for heaven's sake. It is probably a resignation note." But no one believed that now. Mr. Bell took the envelope carefully, opened it with the silver letter knife from the tray, and drew out the pages inside. The paper made a soft, dry sound in the bright kitchen. Claire watched his face change first. Grant saw it next. And when Mr. Bell lifted the first page and began to read, the morning finally stopped pretending it was ordinary. Mr. Bell's voice remained measured, but the kitchen no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the letter. "I understood your English from the first day I entered this house," he read, and even the young agency girl by the pantry seemed to stop breathing. Evelyn's face did not collapse all at once. It tightened by degrees, as though each word forced another layer of certainty out of her. Grant stood motionless beside the island, one hand resting flat against the marble. Claire folded her arms across herself, not for comfort, but to hold still under the force of what was coming. Mr. Bell turned. "The page. I understood when Mrs. Whitmore told her guests that I was restful because I had no opinions. I understood when one of them called me sweet and simple. I understood when Mrs. Whitmore said some people were better suited to service, with less ambition and less confusion. I understood when laughter followed, because cruelty does not require a raised voice to be heard clearly." No one in the room moved. The espresso machine gave a small mechanical click and fell silent. Outside the kitchen window, a groundskeeper crossed the back lawn with a leaf blower slung over one shoulder, unaware that inside the house, a different kind of weather had arrived. Evelyn opened her mouth as if to interrupt, then closed it. There was nothing she could deny. The words were too exact. Not close. Not paraphrased. Exact. Mr. Bell continued. You assumed my silence meant I did not know what was being said around me. It did not. My silence meant I knew exactly what kind of room I was standing in. Grant slowly removed his hand from the counter. His wedding ring flashed once in the morning light, then disappeared as he lowered it to his side. Claire looked at her mother, and for the first time there was no hesitation in her expression, no uncertainty left to soften what she saw. Mr. Bell read on. I also understood every instruction I was given, including the one spoken carelessly because you believed understanding had to look or sound like you before it could count. I understood your lunch orders, your donor calls, your florist revisions, your dry cleaning receipts, your daughter's college deadlines, your husband's medication reminders, your house manager's inventory mistakes, and your guest list errors before they became public embarrassments. I understood enough to fix what others overlooked, and I did so quietly because I believed usefulness might earn respect where dignity alone had not. Grant closed his eyes for one brief second. Claire's gaze dropped to the luncheon folder on the island, to the tabs Naomi had written by hand, to the tiny coded marks that suddenly looked less like staff notes and more like evidence. Evelyn drew herself up, but the posture no longer read as elegant. It read as exposed. This is manipulative, she said, though her voice had lost its center. Mr. Bell did not stop reading. If this letter feels unkind, please understand that it is only honest. Honesty sounds sharp in houses where appearances are softened before truth is allowed through the door. The sentence seemed to settle into the marble, the copper, the white cabinets, the very air. Claire pressed her lips together. Grant looked toward the back service door, as if he could still picture Naomi stepping through it before dawn, coat buttoned, keys placed neatly beside the breakfast tray she had prepared for people who had mistaken her restraint for emptiness. Mr. Bell lifted the next page, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped almost imperceptibly, not from weakness, but from the gravity of what Naomi had chosen to say next. I heard every word, he read. The question is whether any of you ever heard yourselves. Mr. Bell turned to the final page, and by then no one in the kitchen looked at one another anymore. They looked at the marble, the windows, the silver tray, anywhere except the place where truth had gathered. There are things you should know before you call my leaving inconvenient, he read, and Grant's head lifted slightly at that word, because it was one he had used himself more than once about delayed flights, canceled reservations, and people whose labor had always been invisible until it stopped. Last October, when the donor list for the Children's Hospital Gala was sent with 2 names missing, I found the error in the draft and corrected it before the invitations went out. Mrs. Whitmore never knew because the printer blamed a software glitch, and I allowed him to. Evelyn's eyes shifted toward the luncheon folder as if it might offer defense, but there was none there. Mr. Bell continued. In January, when Mr. Whitmore's medication refill was left off the weekly pharmacy order, I noticed the empty backup bottle in the upstairs cabinet and called it in before the storm closed the roads. I did not mention it afterward because care should not become performance. Grant swallowed once, slowly. Claire looked at him, startled, and saw in his face that Naomi was telling the truth. In March, when Miss Claire's financial aid forms were submitted with one signature missing from the online packet, I stayed late, checked the confirmation email against the saved PDF, and left the corrected page on the study printer before the deadline closed at midnight. Claire's hand rose to her mouth. She remembered that night. The panic, the frozen screen, the relief when the missing page had somehow appeared. She had thanked no one because she had never known whom to thank. In June, Mr. Bell read, I moved Mrs. Galloway away from and Pierce at your summer luncheon and prevented a public argument that would have reached every charity board from Greenwich to Manhattan by noon. Yesterday evening, I stopped a guest with a tree nut allergy from eating the pear tart because I had read the bakery notes more carefully than the host had. The agency girl near the pantry lowered her eyes at once. Even she understood now that this was no resignation. It was an accounting, not of money, of grace, of competence, of all the quiet corrections that had allowed other people to remain polished. Evelyn let out a strained breath. Why would she write all of this? She asked, though the question sounded less like disbelief and more like pleading. Claire answered before Mr. Bell could. Because you would have called her ungrateful otherwise. The words landed harder than any shout could have. Grant looked at his daughter, then at his wife, and for the first time that morning the old structure of the room changed. Not in furniture. In alignment. Mr. Bell lowered his gaze to the page and read the last passage with a softness that made it cut even deeper. I did not stay because I was confused. I stayed because my grandmother taught me that work can be honest even when the room is not. I stayed because order matters to me. I stayed because this house was full of people who mistook efficiency for worth, and I wondered whether kindness might still live somewhere between the polished surfaces. Sometimes it did. Usually, it arrived from Claire. Never from the one who needed it most. Claire's eyes filled at once, not with dramatic tears, but with the sudden ache of being the only one named with mercy. Evelyn sat down slowly at the breakfast table as if her knees had forgotten their purpose. The kitchen remained bright, elegant, immaculate. But beneath the morning light, every object now seemed to accuse. The labeled folders, the sorted mail, the corrected seating chart, the breakfast tray prepared by hands no one had deserved. And as Mr. Bell folded the last page with a care that felt almost sacred, Grant finally understood the most humiliating part of all. Naomi had not merely heard them. She had protected them, again and again, while they were busy deciding what she could not possibly understand. No one told Mr. Bell to continue, but no one asked him to stop either. The letter was over. The silence it left behind was not. It spread through the kitchen and settled over everything Naomi had touched, from the folded linen napkins in the drawer to the handwritten labels along the pantry shelves, from the polished silver sugar tongs on the tray to the little blue pencil mark beside Mrs. Galloway's name on the luncheon chart. Evelyn sat at the breakfast table with one hand still resting near her untouched coffee, but the posture she had worn for years like armor had finally slipped. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was quieter than that. More humiliating. Her shoulders had lowered by less than an inch, yet the whole room could feel the difference. Grant looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the polite softness he usually used to smooth over his wife's sharper edges. She understood English, he said. We are the ones who never understood grace. Claire closed her eyes at that, not because the words were cruel, but because they were true in exactly the way the letter had been true. Evelyn lifted her head slowly. Do not speak to me as if I am the only one standing in this kitchen, she said, though there was no force behind it now, only exhaustion and the first brittle note of shame. Grant did not raise his voice. He did not need to. You were the one she named. The sentence landed and remained there. Evelyn looked away first, toward the service door Naomi had used every morning and every night. The same door Evelyn had passed 1,000 times without ever wondering what it meant to always enter a house through the back. Sunlight poured across the floor in a pale square, bright enough to show the faint outline where Naomi's shoes had dried after rain the week before. Claire stepped toward the island and touched the envelope with 2 fingers, as if it had become something fragile. She thanked me, Claire said softly, more to herself than anyone else. After everything, she still thanked me. Mr. Bell folded the pages carefully and placed them back inside the envelope. That says more about Miss Carter than it does about any of us, he replied. Evelyn let out a slow breath, and for the first time all morning she looked less offended than lost. I never told her not to speak, she said, reaching for a defense that even she seemed to know was already falling apart. I did not forbid anything. I simply assumed. She stopped there, because that was the whole ruin of it, sitting plain and ugly in the center of the sentence. Claire looked at her mother with something steadier than anger. Yes, she said. You assumed. Outside, the florist van pulled up along the gravel drive. Through the windows, pale pink peonies bobbed in metal buckets, waiting to be carried into a house that suddenly felt unworthy of them. The intercom buzzed once from the wall. No one answered. Grant removed his glasses and set them on the counter with quiet care. Call her, Evelyn said suddenly, looking at Mr. Bell, then at Grant, then anywhere but the letter. We need to call her. We need to explain. Mr. Bell did not move. I do not believe Miss Carter left without considering that possibility, Mrs. Whitmore. Claire's eyes filled again, but this time she did not look away. She is not waiting for an explanation, she said. She already heard everything. The words stayed in the kitchen after she spoke them, clean and final. Evelyn pressed her fingertips to her temple as if she could think her way backward through the past year, back through the dinner table laughter, the careful cruelties, the false patience in her own voice. But there are some doors that only open one way. By the time she looked up again, the tray Naomi had arranged that morning seemed unbearable to look at. Not because it was wrong, because it was perfect. Claire was the one who moved first. She crossed the kitchen without another word, past the breakfast tray Naomi had set with such exact care, and pushed open the back service door into the thin white light of morning. Cold air rushed in at once, carrying the smell of wet cedar, trimmed hedges, and the last leaves clinging to the far stone wall. The gravel path behind the house still held the dark shine of dawn frost where the sun had not reached it yet. Claire stepped onto the flagstone landing barefoot, the cold biting immediately through her skin, but she kept going until she reached the edge of the herb garden where Naomi sometimes stood for a minute before starting the day. From there, the driveway curved toward the iron gate, empty now except for the florist van and the groundskeeper's cart. No dark coat, no familiar figure, no second chance waiting politely in the cold, only the quiet and the small undeniable proof that someone had already gone. Near the back step, half hidden by the rosemary planter, lay a pair of thin gardening gloves Naomi used when she trimmed the basil and deadhead the hydrangeas no one remembered to praise. Claire bent and picked them up. The fingertips were worn soft. One seam had been restitched by hand with dark thread. She stood there for a long moment with the gloves in her hands, looking at the gate as if looking hard enough might reverse time. Inside the house behind her, the voices had gone low again. Not resolved, just smaller. Grant was on the phone canceling and rearranging with the clipped restraint of a man trying to restore order to something that no longer obeyed him. Mr. Bell was directing the florist through the front hall with formal calm. Evelyn did not come outside. She remained in the kitchen where the light was too clear and the breakfast tray too perfect, sitting in front of the coffee that had gone cold while she looked at the envelope as though it had changed the architecture of the room. Perhaps it had. Houses like the Whitmores were built to hold art, money, and polished conversation. They were not built to hold the full sound of their own failures. Claire turned the gloves over once in her hands and noticed a faint blue ink mark on the cuff of one, the same shade Naomi had used for labels, schedules, and the letter now resting on the marble island like a final act of service nobody had earned. She pressed the gloves lightly to her chest and closed her eyes. Not to cry, not exactly, just to steady the ache of understanding that had arrived too late to be useful. When she opened them, again, the sunlight had shifted a little farther across the stones, touching the threshold Naomi had crossed before dawn. Claire walked back to the door and paused there, one hand on the brass handle still cool from the air outside. Behind her, the garden remained still. Ahead of her, the house waited in its expensive silence, brighter now and somehow barer than before. She stepped inside and set the gloves carefully beside the envelope on the counter. No one spoke. The refrigerator hummed. The florist's footsteps moved faintly through the front hall. A spoon settled again.